1. Bobby Golden was feeling good. The beer he'd taken from his dad's garage was already giving him a slight buzz, and even better than that, he'd finally convinced Nancy Kyles to come out driving with him. She was the head cheerleader, so it was only natural that they went out. After all, he was the quarterback of the Summerville Sasquatches, and around here that meant something. It meant he was a winner. And winners get all girls. That was just science as far as Bobby was concerned. "Bobby, it's creepy out here," Nancy told him as they laid out on the blanket in the bed of his truck. She'd said that twice now, and Bobby knew it was creepy. That was the point. Why else would anyone park out in a cornfield in the middle of the night? "Now babe, it's not that bad," he said, trying to soothe her, hoping that she'd snuggle just a little closer. "Maybe to you it's not. You're out here all the time," she told him flippantly. Bobby grimaced. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that you took Billie Jean out here too, and Sally, and let's not forget Miranda," she told him, sounding cross. Baby, you got it all wrong. That's true, but it's all different now. That was all before I met you," he told her. After all, it wasn't his fault it had taken her so long to become head cheerleader. Nancy looked out into the field and back at him. "You better be telling the truth, because I'm not as easy as Sally or Billie Jean." "Of course I am. It's all about you now, head cheerleader and quarterback, that's just natural," he told her and leaned in to kiss her. She pushed him away at first, her eyes fixated on the sky. "What's that?" she asked, pointing up at the starfield sky. Bobby followed where she was looking. "I don't know, stars and shit, I reckon. Now come here." "Stars and shit, really?" she asked, laughing. "Yeah, now get over here. I'm cold and lonely with you way over there. The stars aren't going anywhere." He chuckled and leaned in. Then they began making out again, hot and heavy. He was just starting to cop a feel, sneaking his other hand around her back to unclasp her bra when she pushed him back again. "Bobby, look," she exclaimed. "What?" He groaned and looked back up at the sky, annoyed, but then he saw it. The star she had pointed out was getting closer and closer, making him think maybe it wasn't a star at all. But if it wasn't a star, then what was it? He had a sinking feeling they were about to find out, and that they weren't going to like the answer. The star seemed to fill the sky in front of them with burning light, which was so bright they had to shield their eyes and look away. It soared over his truck and crashed into the cornfield with an echoing boom, leaving a trail of scorched and damaged cornstalks in its wake. "What the fuck was that?" Nancy asked, her voice hardly more than a whisper. Bobby swallowed and shrugged. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Nancy pushed him. "Are you crazy, Bobby? God knows what that was. It could be dangerous." "Nah, it's probably nothing more than one of those meteorites, and those suckers are worth some serious money. Especially the large pieces. Dale told me you can get up to $1,000 for a single piece," he told her. "Get enough of it and maybe we could go somewhere nice and private," he added. "The Summerville Suites motel isn't nice, Bobby," she shot back. "What about an out-of-town motel?" "You'd really do that?" she asked him, biting his bottom lip. "Anything for you, baby," he promised, going in for another kiss. Chugging down the rest of his beer to steady himself and make him feel more brave than he felt, Bobby climbed out of the back of the truck and headed out to the field. He heard something clatter behind him and spun. But it was just Nancy jumping down to follow him. "I don't want to stay here by myself," she told him. He couldn't argue that he wouldn't want to stay put if he was in her position either. They walked into the cornfield following the still smoking trail. When it came to an end, they didn't know what to say. One thing was for sure, it definitely wasn't a meteorite. Unless meteorites looked like spaceships, which Bobby was pretty sure they didn't. He wasn't positive, but was pretty sure that this wasn't a meteorite or anything even close to it. Whatever it was had a conical shape, with the front buried into the dirt from how it landed. There was gibberish of some sort written on the side. He couldn't make it out. "Bobby, I want to go home," Nancy said, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Okay, just 1 minute." Bobby told her he was trying to make sense of everything. Though being honest, going home sounded like a really smart plan to him right now. There was a sudden whooshing sound and part of the ship slid back, revealing an opening. He took off running back to the truck as soon as he saw one large green hand followed by another climb out. They had just made it back to the mouth of the field and were running to the truck when they heard a screech from the ship. Whatever climbed out of that thing didn't sound happy, thought Bobby. Yes, JJLKK. It was a viperous hissing sound. They turned and looked. Bobby felt like he was going to be sick just looking at it. There in the mouth of the burned-out trail and fully visible in the moonlight was a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen. It stood around 6 feet tall with green scaly skin. The creature's head looked like that of an iguana, its body all lizard-like, yet it was clothed in a silver metallic suit. It was almost like something out of a bad movie. The worst part was he was pretty much sure that it was holding a gun. One that was pointed directly at them. Yes, JJJLLK, it hissed at them again. That was when Nancy screamed so loud that it made Bobby's ears ring. The thing roared again. Clearly pissed now. It pulled the trigger on the weird gun it held. A beam of green light shot out and hit his truck. If he'd expected an explosion, he was disappointed. What actually happened was 100 times scarier. The truck simply crumbled into ash. That was when he and Nancy hauled ass into the woods as fast as they could. The lizard alien thing screaming at them as they went by. It got Nancy first. Bobby couldn't help it. She was just too slow to keep up with him. Bobby, don't leave me. She screamed at him as he took off past her like he had the 10-yard line in his sights. The next scream she let out was in fear and pain. He didn't even turn back to see what it did to her. He was just happy when she stopped. Bobby could see the blacktop. He was going to be okay. Just as she was about to burst out of the woods and leap into the road, something grabbed him and pulled him back. He landed on his back with a hard thud which drove all the air out of his body. Lying on his back, he looked up to see the creature standing over him. It took something out of its pockets. A small metal cylinder, but when it hit a button, a bunch of metallic arms came out of it. Those arms all seemed to be full of blades. Bobby started screaming as it pulled him up and closer to those blades, which were now spinning faster and faster. Soon those screams became higher and more guttural, and unlike Nancy, screamed for a long time. 2. McGrady pulled over to the gas station, proudly proclaiming itself as Bubba's Gas and Gulp. A 2-story log home and convenience store which also sold diesel, gas, several brands of domestic beer, and according to the sign, the best fried chicken in all of Summerville. Which, even though his stomach rumbled slightly at the thought McGrady wasn't about to break his rule against gas station food yet. The place was a one-stop shop with a sole rusty pickup sitting out front, a far cry from what he was used to coming out of Kansas City. He was used to the plethora of chain service stations that dotted around the city and interstate. This place looked like the backdrop of a horror movie waiting to happen. Reaching down like he was tying his shoe, McGrady made sure his backup pistol was still safe and secure. He doubted he'd need it, but the years spent as a cop working the streets had shown him time and time again just how ugly life could get when people thought they were safe. He wasn't willing to take a chance. Middle of nowhere, a gas station place like this would be the perfect place to commit a crime. Something about this place was off, something he couldn't put his finger on, but whatever it was had his cop senses tingling. He'd learned to listen to those gut feelings a lot over the years. They'd saved his life more than once. Sighing as he walked around the old sedan, McGrady watched the highway for a moment just to see if another car would go by. None did. It was just him out here, well, him and the clerk inside. Looking over at the pump, he groaned inwardly. There wasn't a card reader. He'd have to go inside after all. He'd been trying to avoid that, even though he wouldn't mind grabbing a drink or a snack for the rest of the drive into town. The place just felt too off to him. It was the same feeling he'd had as a kid standing in front of an abandoned house. Like something sinister was waiting inside, waiting for him. Back then he'd been scared of ghosts and vampires. Now he was more worried about a psycho with a gun. But of course Bubba's would be a cash place, forcing his hand. Looking through his wallet, he found a 10. Looks like he wasn't going to get much gas after all. Hopefully, that would be enough for him to make it into Summerville. That way he could get settled before going in for the new job. Or at the minimum, get a couple of hours of shut-eye before his first day. The inside of Bubba's was dim, just a couple of flickering lights and some Twinkies that were more dust than wrapper at this point. "Hello," McGrady called out, shocked that it seemed like no one was around. It was only a little after 8, and the place seemed to be completely deserted. Most places would have at least locked the doors if they were closed. He knew people were more trusting in small towns, but this was a little ridiculous. He had yet to put the star on his chest, but he had a letter saying he was the acting sheriff of Summerville. Which was weird because he had always thought it was an elected position, not an ad he could answer online. But that's what happened, and here he was with a letter from the mayor's office in his jacket. Listening, he didn't so much as hear a mouse skitter. Even though he couldn't hear anyone, something felt wrong, like he wasn't alone. Times like these made him wish he wore his shoulder holster more. There wasn't a threat he could see though, and the last thing he needed was to be walking around with his backup weapon out in a gas station on his first day in town. Whatever was going on, Bubba's was more than quiet, besides the mechanical noises of the various refrigerators and drink machines. It was silent. Had something bad happened here? He checked the aisle. Lights flickered overhead as he passed by chips and jerky and other off-brand junk food that he barely recognized. In the back were soft drinks and beer. The beer cooler looked a little empty, so apparently people did shop here after all. "Help you, mister?" An old voice crackled from behind him. McGrady had to fight the urge to draw his gun as he turned around. Standing behind the counter was now an old man who, to McGrady, looked a lot like a bespectacled Elmer Fudd. "Can I help you, mister?" The man asked again, giving McGrady a look as though he were the crazy. McGrady looked at him, putting his hands in his pockets so the other man wouldn't see them shake from the spike of adrenaline. "I might need some gas, $10 worth on pump 2 please," he told him as he walked up, looking around and wondering just where the other man had come from. "Sure thing. Where are you headed?" "Summerville should be pretty close now," McGrady replied. The man nodded sagely. "Sure is, this here is Summerville County. You'll be in the town proper in about 10-15 minutes probably. Don't usually get many tourists through here usually though." McGrady chuckled. "I can see that. I guess I'm not really a tourist. I'm the new sheriff, or I will be tomorrow," he told him. The man looked him over. "Well, howdy Sheriff, I'm Bubba Clems." McGrady took his old hand, shocked at how cold it was. "Enrique McGrady, but I just go by McGrady." "Whatever you say, Sheriff," Bubba said and leaned in. "Though if you don't mind me saying, you might find this town is a little weird." "You don't say?" Bubba nodded. "It's not your average town, that's for sure." "What do you mean by that?" McGrady asked. "Oh, you'll see. Let's just say a lot of the folks are a little more eccentric than most," Bubba told him, nodding. "Anyway, you're all set, Sheriff. Enjoy the drive." McGrady hoped Bubba would say more, but when he didn't, he walked out and pumped his gas, reminding himself that when driving around here he would need to carry cash on him. He wondered if the lack of card readers was a quirk of eccentric locals or the side effect of not having enough customers to carry the fees. After starting the car, he went to take one last look over Bubba's gas and gulped, finding it odd that now the lights were off. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was almost as if Bubba had been waiting for him to come by. He shook his head as he pulled back onto the road. Now he was just being paranoid. But he couldn't help think about what Bubba had told him about the town not being like most towns. Just the ramblings of a crazy old man, he told himself as he continued to drive. Bubba had been right about one thing though. Summerville was only about 10 minutes away. It was as if the cornfields opened up to reveal it to him. Compared to Chicago, it wasn't much, but to McGrady, it looked exactly like what he needed. A smattering of old houses and family-owned and operated businesses. The kind of small-town Americana that only existed on a TV screen. In his youth he'd have avoided this place like the plague, but midway through his 30s quiet wasn't so much a bad word. He read their names as he passed. Ruth's Cafe, the Midnight Rambler Saloon, the Summerville Times, Hab's Hardware, and finally Mike's Grocery. Across from which was the sheriff's station. Nothing more than a small square building, inside of which was probably a single jail cell and a couple of desks. McGrady tried to imagine it sitting out in the dark, but all he could come up with was the inside of Marshal Dillion's office in Gunsmoke. Even he doubted the building was that small. At least he hoped it wasn't. He pulled his car onto the next street and into the driveway of the small single-story Cape Cod-style bungalow behind the sheriff's station, and prayed that the letter he'd received was correct. The position of sheriff came with a residence. Another reason he'd taken the job. It was the only time outside of the academy he'd heard of room and board being offered with this job. It had been one of the deciding factors for him to take the job, and McGrady was never one to look a gift horse in the mouth. The key they'd sent him worked, which made his nerves settle just a little. The inside of the house was furnished. As furnished as a smaller 2-bedroom, 1-bath with a living room, kitchen, attic, and basement could be. He was surprised to find that someone had already cleaned the house. On the table was a gift basket filled with pastries, and there was a pie. The letter simply said, "Welcome to the new sheriff, and to be in the office tomorrow at 8 a.m. In the bedroom he found 4 sets of uniforms, more than enough for him to cycle between. Without knowing what else to do, McGrady went to bed, looking forward to getting to work first thing in the morning and getting a proper introduction to his new home. 3. McGrady felt good when his alarm went off. He felt even better as he walked through the door of the sheriff's station in his crisp new uniform. A portly older woman sat behind a half-moon desk facing the entrance when he walked in. She stood up. "Good morning, you must be the new sheriff." "What gave it away?" he asked cheerfully. She did not seem to be in the joking mood. "Well, I'm Meredith, and if you'd just follow me, I'll show you the rest of the office," she told him, pushing her wireframe glasses up a little higher on her nose. She turned quickly, giving McGrady little choice but to follow her as she showed him the lockup areas, armory, the one lonely squad car out back, and lastly his office. A small, almost closet-sized space that was home to a desk, a phone, and a chair. There were some books and things on the one shelf by the wall and a mug that said "World's Best Sheriff" sitting on the desk. "Cozy," McGrady commented. "Sure is, sir. This here is a quiet town, so you'll have plenty of time to make it your own," Meredith reassured him. "Oh goody," he thought, looking at the office. Then he realized what the place was missing. The one thing that he hadn't seen on the tour, the one thing every elite police force ran on. "Meredith, where's the coffee maker?" She shrugged. "We don't have one." For a moment he was speechless. "Why not?" "The last sheriff threw it out." He said it made him paranoid. Coffee made him paranoid? He asked her. She shook her head. No, the coffee maker made him paranoid. How? He was convinced it was sending signals out about his day-to-day routines. She replied candidly. Oh. I never asked, but what happened to the last sheriff? McGrady asked, knowing that the last man to hold his position wouldn't be the first lawman to crack under the pressure as time went on. But he'd never heard of any cop throwing out his coffee maker. In their line of work, it was about the only thing you actually could trust. She shrugged again. Nobody knows, he just kind of disappeared. State police came in and looked for him for a while, but near the end he was paranoid, constantly talking about all sorts of conspiracy theories. I think they just chalked it up to him not wanting to be found. I like to think he's living in one of those off-grid communities with the rest of the nut jobs. And there it was. No wonder they had to seek out-of-town applications. The last sheriff was some sort of nutcase, and to make matters worse, there was probably already a case file on him somewhere that would put the office in a bad light if the media ever caught wind of it. Did he leave any case files or anything? Any open investigations I need to know about? Well, that's the weird part. She started saying. He used to have a file cabinet in the office, but one night he moved the whole thing. He was convinced that pages were going missing. Can you believe he thought that there was some sort of conspiracy surrounding this place, as if I don't have better things to do than move stuff around whenever he wasn't looking? Nope. Sure can't. So no one has heard from the last sheriff at all? He asked, genuinely intrigued. She shook her head. Nope. Not that I've heard of. Which is weird because he left a lot of his clothes and stuff in his car. Like he was going to drive away and then just decided not to. Wait. He left his car behind? He asked, not quite believing what he was hearing. Of course, it's the other car in the lot. You'd think that he'd send for it once he made it wherever he was going. Wouldn't surprise me if he didn't ditch it thinking it was being tracked or some such nonsense. Probably just hopped the bus and headed out. Why do you say that? McGrady asked, though he was pretty sure he knew the answer. I don't know for sure, but he had to get out of town somehow. She told him and then walked back up to her desk, making it clear that she wasn't interested in furthering this line of conversation. Which suited McGrady just fine because before he really got down to business on this case, what he really needed was some caffeine. While it wasn't technically an official investigation, something in his gut told him that whatever happened to the old sheriff, it wasn't good. Still, he almost couldn't believe that his first case as the new sheriff of Summerville was looking into the disappearance of his predecessor. He'd figured he'd have to be sworn in or something, but non-ceremoniously, Meredith simply reached into her desk drawer and handed him the star, making his new position absolutely official. He was now without a doubt the sheriff. Without further ado, he walked out of the station and headed straight across the street to Mike's grocery, praying that they sold coffee makers. 4. When McGrady walked into Mike's grocery store, he was happy that someone was actually at the register. He reminded himself to see what was up with Bubba too whenever he got around to it. Something about that place rubbed him the wrong way, and he wanted to get to the bottom of it. But that would have to wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was coffee. Good dark bold little beans that could change his morning from exhausting to wonderful in the blink of an eye. Was he a caffeine addict? Maybe, but as far as addictions went, he figured it was low enough on the list not to worry about it. And that's all the reasoning Sheriff McGrady needed to walk out of the office without a radio and over to Mike's. Morning, he told the guy who must be Mike. A short, somewhat pudgy guy with thinning blonde hair who was probably only a couple of years younger than himself. Mike looked up nervously at the sheriff. It was clear that he was a little timid. "Oh, morning, Sheriff. Can I help you find anything?" Mike asked him. "Which aisle is the coffee on?" McGrady asked. "Which kind?" "The dark kind." Mike nodded. "So do you want that as Arabica, Caribbean roast, Colombian, French blend? What about a strain of Haitian beans I picked up recently?" McGrady sighed. "I'm not going to be able to just grab a bag of coffee and walk out of the door, am I?" Mike shook his head and smiled. "Nope, first we have to pick the beans and then run it through the grinder. But don't worry, all the beans are pre-roasted now. They have to be after that last incident in the teacher's lounge over at Summerville High. Ever heard of African coffee moths?" "Neither had I, but don't worry, there haven't been any more incidents." "African coffee died, you know what?" "Never mind. Do you sell any regular pre-bagged coffee, Folgers perhaps?" Mike looked at the sheriff like he had several heads. "No, because I don't hate my customers, Sheriff. What they need is fresh produce, quality meats at good prices, and actually decent coffee. Not that chemical garbage the chain grocery stores sell. No, here you get coffee like it's meant to be drank. Does it take a little extra work? Sure it does, but it's worth it. And people like this. Picking beans out of a barrel and whatnot?" McGrady asked. "Well, they don't really have a choice, do they? I mean, after all, I'm the only grocery store. Plus, once you find the beans you like, I can get you set up with a weekly order, just like all your groceries, and have them delivered to you. You all do that here? McGrady asked, remembering when people used to do that in his neighborhood growing up. Sure. Mike told him as he went about looking for beans like the sheriff described. After all, it's a small town we got here and the kids need to make money somehow. Plus, the community really seems to like it. Makes sense. Look, just give me the French roast and we'll play 20 flavors when I have some more time. It's your money, Mike said as he poured some beans into a bag and then started putting them through the grinder. In what felt like no time at all, he had McGrady out the door with a bag filled with freshly ground coffee. The smell was downright aromatic, and he had to admit that maybe this was the better way to do things after all. The best part was that he didn't even have to pony up any money. Since he was a local, Mike started his tab, one that he would close out the next paycheck. Still, it was a big difference from city living, that was for sure. When he walked back into the office, Meredith had found an old coffee maker in the shed out back and put it into his office. McGrady sank down in his chair, listening to the steady drip of the percolator, wondering how his life had turned out so great. Here he was, the sheriff of a town where nothing happened, just riding it out until he could collect a pension. And in many ways he was his own boss. A feat almost unheard of in law enforcement. You know what? He thought. I might take a nap today, or even go fishing. And why not? As long as he kept a radio on him at all times, he should be able to do that. Meredith surely didn't seem like she cared one way or the other. He was still thinking peaceful thoughts when the dinging of the percolator started, signaling that his coffee was now done. The smell filled his office and he was practically salivating as he walked across the room, mug in hand, ready for the first cup of the day. Sheriff, you've got to get out to Farmer Jones' field now, Meredith interrupted, barging into his office. Our what? He asked, still staring down at the full coffee pot. You need to get out there right this instant. Jones said somebody blew a truck up right out in the cornfield. Can you believe that? She asked him. No, I can't, he told her, unable to tear his eyes away from the dark, rich nectar. Meredith, we wouldn't happen to have travel mugs or anything here, do we? She shook her head. Of course not, he replied. Tell him I'm on my way. Oh, and Meredith, can you tell me where exactly does this Farmer Jones live? He asked. I'll get my nephew to take you out there, she told him. Nephew? He asked, but before he could stop her, she had already walked out of the office, headed out the front door and across the street, making it clear who her nephew was. With a sigh, McGrady took one more look at the freshly brewed pot of coffee before trudging out the door and heading to the cruiser. It looked like it was going to be a long, busy day after all. 5. Sheriff McGrady sighed as the Summerville sheriff's cruiser sputtered and putted all the way out to the farm. They'd ridden in silence the whole way. McGrady, of course, was comfortable in that silence. From the awkward fidgeting of Mike, it was clear that he was not. McGrady had tried twice to breach conversation, but all the man wanted to talk about was modern stocking and inventory methods, which made McGrady want to jump out of the car. He couldn't believe that people this boring actually existed. To each their own, he figured. Then there was the cruiser. His first order of business was going to be to get a new one for the department. He figured being a small department, funding probably wasn't great, but this thing was practically falling apart. There was duct tape on the steering wheel, for God's sakes. Not to mention the smell of stale nachos that seemed to be everywhere in the car, even though he'd looked everywhere and couldn't find any in the car. It really gave him doubts about the last sheriff's diet. Turn here, Mike told him, pointing to the right. McGrady nodded and turned the wheel to the right. He had to admit, if he hadn't had Mike with him, he would have cruised right past it. It was nothing more than a small gravel drive way out in the middle of a cornfield. Going down, it was almost peaceful. This is probably where they went in, Mike spoke up again, pointing to another side road that cut around the first field. Jones lives way on down at the end of the road, but the side roads for the fields tend to attract local kids looking to party, Mike confided to him. I'll remember that, McGrady told him, mentally adding that to his patrol route. After all, what kind of sheriff would he be if he didn't hassle teenagers from time to time? Pulling off onto the side road, he could make out the deep ruts from the truck that Jones must have been talking about. When the path got muddy, it was clear they'd have to walk. Neither one of them wanted to get the truck stuck out there. McGrady wasn't even sure there was a tow truck company in this town. I don't want to get stuck out here, McGrady told him. Mike shrugged. Okay, well, see you when you get back. What? McGrady asked incuriously. What do you mean, what? Mike asked, settling down into his seat, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a Mars bar. The sound of him riffling the wrapper filled the car. You realize you're coming with me, right? He told him. Why would I do that? He asked, cramming the candy bar into his mouth and chewing loudly. Because if I leave you in the car and you get killed, then I'm in trouble. McGrady replied dryly. Mike chewed a little slower and then swallowed. That's I didn't think about that. Most people don't. McGrady said, stepping out onto the muddy ground. Hating the sound of his boots squashing into the mud. Why'd it have to be a field? Could have been worse. Mike said dryly, looking down at his own loafers as they sunk into the mud. Could have been a quarry. There's quarries around here? McGrady asked him as they continued walking up the path. Lots of old ones all over the place around here. Mike replied, slapping a twisted cornstalk out of his face. Most people stay away from them though. Those old tunnels and such can get pretty dangerous if you aren't careful. McGrady was about to say something else when they came out into a clearing. I think we found the truck. He muttered dryly, looking at the sight in front of him. It was Bobby's truck, all right. All the way down to the license plate. The only problem is the front of the cab was completely melted. It looked like someone had taken a magnifying glass to a Matchbox car. Mike dropped his Mars bar looking at it. You ever seen anything like this back in the city? McGrady shook his head. Nope, this is definitely a first for me. I've seen my fair share of burned out cars, but this is something else. How in the world do you melt a truck? Mike asked, astounded, walking around the vehicle and whistling at the damage. The real question is, what do you use to do it? McGrady clarified, thinking it over and not liking any of the prospects. Suddenly Mike stopped walking. Shush, Sheriff, he said almost too quietly to hear. McGrady walked over. What happened? You drop another candy bar or something? He asked, kind of wishing he had one himself. Or at least had finished his cup of coffee. It wasn't right trying to do police work with no caffeine. In fact, it was downright unnatural. All thoughts of eating evacuated his mind as he stared down at the pink mass of flesh in front of him. Someone's insides were now on the outside. Sheriff, the skin's all gone. Mike said, his face was as white as a ghost. McGrady pulled his mustache twice. I hate this town. I think I really do. He said out loud and then squared down to get lower to the body and better examine what was left of it. It was official. Whoever this had been was unrecognizable. Someone had basically melted them down like the car. That just isn't possible, Mike kept saying, looking like he was going to be sick. They both jumped as the corn rustled for a minute, expecting the attacker had returned. Instead, when it parted, they were greeted with a very shaken Nancy. Mike greeted her. The girl looked like she'd been wandering around the cornfields all night. She was wounded, blood soaked the front of her sweater, and it looked something had taken a chunk out of her shoulder. She'd have to be examined for other injuries. She walked right past them, clearly in shock, until Mike grabbed her. Nancy, what happened to Bobby? She started sobbing. It took his skin. She wailed it repeatedly, while McGrady and Mike walked her up the path to the farmhouse to call an ambulance. It was looking like they had a lot of work to do after all. 6. Across town at Waterman's Gas and Gulp, Clestis and Leroy were looking over the latest edition of Tractors and Treads, eyeing half-naked models sprawled across dozers and jawing about this and that. When Bobby walked in, the bell on the door rung, making Leroy look up from the counter and Clestis look a little ashamed, turning the page from a beer model to a nice article about the proper maintenance of John Deere PTOs and an ad for the new line of New Hollands. Afternoon, Bobby, you excited for the big game? Leroy asked him. They had $50 on it, so it was easy to say they were interested in the answer. High school sports were just about the only live sporting events in Summerville. Bobby stopped and looked them up and down. Something seemed wrong, but neither of the men could put their finger on what. Drinking half the morning can do a thing like that to a man, so they didn't notice that his skin seemed lumpy in some places, or that his eyes were nothing more than wicked yellow slits. Me, Bobby? Bobby asked them in a voice that had an awful hiss. Yes, son, and me, Clestis. Clestis said with a laugh and slapped his knee. Say, you all right, boy? Leroy asked him. Me all right, me excited about the big game. Me purchase liquids for consumption, Bobby said and waddled down toward the drink cooler in the back. I can never understand kids and their slang, Clestis replied. When did we get rid of the letter I? Leroy asked him, taking a sip from the open can of Milwaukee's Finest from under the booth. You know, I think I heard something on the radio about that, Clestis replied, flipping back to the dozer picture and whistling wistfully. What I could do with something like that. You shouldn't say such things. What would your wife think? I mean, you got a perfect fully good bobcat back home that does all the clearing you need. But it ain't a dozer. Not a proper one, Clestis told him. If I had a dozer as purty as that, I tell ya, Leroy, I'd clear my entire property just for the hell of it. And that's why you don't need one, Leroy reminded. What the hell is that kid doing now? he asked, looking in the circular mirror that let him see a distorted view of the drink section, where it was painfully clear that Bobby was standing there chugging down drink after drink. Not caring what it was, water, soda, vanilla, cold brew. It all went straight down the hatch. You know, I'm really starting to think that boy's on dope, Clastus told him. They need to start drug testing high school athletes. I'm telling you. They'd lose all the players, Leroy said with a sigh, and opened the little door at the bar so he could walk around and try to get a handle on the kid. Hey Bobby, you know damn well you gotta pay for all this. Don't make me call your old man up here to get it all straightened out. Bobby turned to look at him, and for the briefest of minutes Leroy had the distinct impression that whatever he was looking at wasn't Bobby, wasn't even human. But the booze made his brain buzz, so he knew that all had to be bullshit. Bobby turned back around and went to grab another drink. All right son, I'm done playing, Leroy said, stepping up to him. Clastus called back from the front. You injure him and I automatically win the bet. Leroy muttered under his breath and grabbed at Bobby. As soon as he touched the boy's arm, he knew that something was wrong. It was cold, not warm at all, not like a person's arm should be. Not a living person, at least. Before he could get a handle on half the wild thoughts that were shooting through his mind at that moment, Bobby turned on him and threw him. Now Leroy wasn't a small man, so the fact that Bobby could throw him with one hand into the Slurpee machine was enough to make Clastus drop his magazine and let out a wet, whiny fart. His mouth was still hanging open as Bobby, or the thing that looked like him, turned and walked out of the store. Clastus thought his eyes were going to bug out as Bobby walked on by. His hand, the one that Leroy had grabbed, had come off, revealing a scaly, clawed hand. As soon as the door banged shut behind him, he went to help his friend, who lay sprawled out on the floor covered in just about every flavor of Slurpee the store offered. You okay? Clastus asked dumbly. Leroy shook his head and held up what looked like the skin of the hand. Nope. Better call the sheriff. Clastus nodded. Sometimes I hate this town. Taxes are low though, Leroy shot back. Clastus ran to the phone to call Meredith down at the station without answering, mostly because they both knew Leroy was right. 7. McGrady pulled up to the store. Mike's jaw was open. What the hell happened to the grab and gulp? All McGrady could do was shrug. Shirley made it sound like some sort of robbery, he said flatly, looking at the smashed-up storefront. Smashed out in a way that in all his years on law enforcement he'd never seen. It looked something had physically ripped the doors off the hinges. But that was impossible. Though he was quickly learning that the word impossible might have to be removed from his vocabulary if he was planning to stick around Summerville. Pop the trunk, Mike told him. Why? I want to grab that gun from the back, Mike said sheepishly. You know, just in case. McGrady was about to say something but realized he couldn't blame him. In fact, as he got out, he upholstered his own weapon. Just in case they ran into whatever the hell did this. The entire store looked like King Kong himself had torn through it. Entire shelves had been thrown around, glass doors smashed and off the hinges. Snack food lay trampled on the ground, mingling with what seemed to be a strange mix of soda and blood that coated the floor. What the hell? Mike pointed at the center of the store and then started puking on the corner by the open door. At least take it out by the squad car so you don't contaminate the crime scene, McGrady told him, though he knew just how the other man felt. His own stomach flip-flopped too, looking at the skinless body that lay in the center of the room. He'd seen a lot of bad things working homicide, but this really took the cake. What he couldn't figure out was what the hell could do something like this in such a short time. Carefully, making sure he didn't step in anything, McGrady made his way across the floor over to the body. Doing something that he really didn't want to, he knelt down beside it to get a better look. What the hell did this to you? He asked the corpse, not expecting a reply. He was in a corner and his medical experience stopped past CPR and where to put a tourniquet for a gunshot wound. One thing was certain, he was almost positive that no knife did this. At least none that he'd ever heard of. The meat and muscle were all there, not a chunk out of place. Even the eyes were completely unharmed. Open wide, staring in shock, he really hoped that this man had been dead before he was skinned, but based on the expression now frozen forever in death, he really doubted that was the case. Mike came back in. Doing his best not to look at the corpse, he made his way over behind the counter. Ah, fuck all, he swore and pointed down at the other end of the aisle behind the counter. Curious, McGrady went over to check it out. Oh sweet Jesus, he muttered, at first unsure of what he was looking at. Until his mind made sense of it. There on the floor behind the counter appeared to be the perfect pile of skin. Human skin slid up the back like whoever did it had worn it and then discarded it like an old coat. I got a bad feeling we just found the skin of our missing kid, McGrady said. You don't think? Mike asked, turning away as McGrady lifted a section with his pen. Which made Mike gag again. I don't know what I think anymore, McGrady shot back. Mike grunted and turned back to what he was doing. Digging around, he found the key to the drawer and popped it open. All the money's still here, and on top of that there's a gun still behind the counter here as well. Well, aren't you turning out to be a proper damn deputy? I'm not a deputy. I'm a grocer, a nice respectable grocer and citizen who's very tired of finding flayed corpses now, thank you. McGrady chuckled. Yeah, call the station on your cell phone. Tell Shirley to get the coroner down here. We've got one, maybe two dead. I'm going to go look in the back. But I suspect our perp is long gone. Your perp, McGrady, and sure thing. Mike told him, relieved at being able to walk back outside and away from the horror inside the gas and gulp. The back wasn't that much better off. Though looking at the fried chicken and fixings slowly dying under the heat lamps, McGrady couldn't help but chuckle as his stomach rumbled. It wasn't like he'd had lunch today, and the way things were looking, it might be a while before he did. With a sigh, he walked past it and into the kitchen. Nothing in the back was destroyed as much as the store was up front. For a moment he wondered if the perp had come back here at all. He was just about to turn around and walk back up front when he heard a sound coming from the walk-in cooler. McGrady carefully pulled his weapon from its holster and aimed it at the door. Summerville Sheriff's Department, come out with your hands up. He said loud enough that he knew they would hear him. For a moment nothing happened. Then slowly the door opened. A bead of sweat ran down the side of his face as he thought about just what exactly he might be dealing with. Whatever it was, he would not give it a chance if it was hostile, that much was for sure. McGrady wasn't going to let anyone take his skin. The man that stumbled out didn't look like much of a threat. Tall, white, skinny, and wearing overalls that were a little too big for him. Also, he was clearly in a state of shock. I'm Leroy, he managed to get out before he collapsed on the ground. Just as he reached for his walkie-talkie to call it in, Mike ran back. Sheriff Meredith needs you back at the station, he said. She says it's urgent. Okay. McGrady groaned, looking down at the guy on the ground. Grab an arm. 8. When they got back to the station, the first thing that McGrady noticed was the small crowd gathered there. All of them looking around furiously and brandishing weapons. Looks like he was going to get to deal with a small-town mob on his first day. He didn't have to wonder why they were angry. This was a small town, a safe town. At least that's what he'd at first been led to believe. But more than anything, it was apparently the kind of place where people still would protect what they cared about. He'd seen the same thing happen in the city, especially when crimes with children happened. It often left people feeling angry and confused. Like most cops, he knew reasoning with a mob was downright impossible on a good day, and with a passed-out man in the back and the coroner picking up the body of another. Well, that was more trouble than he wanted, and if they found out about the boy, he didn't even want to think about what could happen. An angry mob could turn into vigilantes real quick, one that wouldn't take long to find someone to punish, whether they were guilty or not. Sheriff. The leader of the mob yelled out as they converged around the cruiser. Howdy, McGrady said to the man, while Mike helped the still surprised-looking Leroy from the back of the cruiser. Why do you have Leroy? Is he under arrest? The man asked. They'd already met before. This was Bobby's dad. Chad Golden. A 40-year-old man who still rocked a high and tight and wore his polos with the collars popped. Another thing he wasn't trying to deal with today. The others in the mob looked in Leroy's direction. Most of them looked like farmers. A couple still wore the shirts saying which of the 2 local chemical plants they worked at. Because there was another attack, McGrady told him. And Leroy's the closest thing we've got to a witness at the moment. He told them honestly, usually as an officer he'd have left that part out. But something told him that no one here was responsible for what was going on. And he had the feeling that when Leroy started talking, whatever he said was going to be a mighty hard pill to swallow. McGrady was willing to believe just anything at this point. Well, what exactly are you doing about? Golden demanded. How are we supposed to feel safe if you can't do your job? He demanded. A couple of yas? Came up from the crowd. McGrady looked around. He sympathized with them. He really did, but unlike him, they didn't realize just how out of their depth they really were. Whatever was doing this wasn't something a bunch of angry townsfolk were going to be able to handle. And if he let this mob do whatever they wanted, then some out-of-town salesman or traveler was going to get attacked out of fear. Then he'd become a pariah when he had to lock up a bunch of them. I'm looking for whoever or whatever is responsible for this, McGrady told him, then addressing the crowd he cleared his throat and used his best authoritative voice he could. I see a lot of you are armed, good. But hassling me isn't going to do a damn thing but make it easier for whoever did this to get away. Now I've got to go inside and talk to Leroy to figure out what exactly the hell we are dealing with around here. And in the meantime, I think you all should go home and use those weapons to protect yourself and your loved ones. With that, most of them dispersed. Thankfully, Mr. Golden stood there fixed to the spot. And what about us that's lost loved ones, Sheriff? He asked close enough that he could smell the stale beer on the other man's breath. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mr. Golden, but you still have other children to think about. Whoever did this is armed and dangerous. I know you're angry and want revenge, but I'm asking you to leave it to me. I will get whoever did this." Mr. Golden seemed like he wanted to say something but bit it back. Finally he shook his head, spat at McGrady's feet and said, "We'll see," before climbing behind the wheel of an antique Jaguar. McGrady watched him disappear down the street before walking inside. He really hoped that Golden listened to him. He couldn't imagine what the man was going through. If he tried to cause any more trouble though, McGrady was going to get him for driving under the influence and let him cool off in a cell. Inside the sheriff's station, Shirley and Mike were chatting while Leroy sat in a chair with a blanket around him, a cup of steaming coffee in his hand. Mike and Shirley had one too. "Any left?" McGrady asked. "Oh no, sorry dear, want me to put another pot on?" she asked. McGrady shook his head sadly, watching them sip their cups with envy. "No, don't worry about it." He sighed and sat down. "Okay," Shirley told him. "That Golden's too hot-headed for his own good, always has been. Glad you could calm them down somewhat." "Don't mention it," he said. "Guy's an asshole if you ask me, pardon my French, Miss Meredith," Mike said and then blushed. "This isn't Sunday school, Mike," she shot back. "Leroy, how are you feeling?" McGrady asked him. "Better, I guess, warm, that's for sure. I was in that freezer until you all showed up," he told them. "Why?" Mike asked him. "Because that thing doesn't like the cold," he told them. "What thing?" McGrady asked, pulling up a chair. "I don't know what it was. At first it walked in looking like Bobby Golden, next thing we know it's tearing up the place going crazy, and when Clestis went to stop him, his skin had just came off." He took a shaky breath and continued. "Next thing we know there's a lizard, the biggest damn one I ever saw, walking around like a man. Well, that was enough for me. I ran straight into the back and locked myself inside. I heard the screaming though. We need to find Clestis." McGrady swore. "You aren't believing this?" Mike asked him. "You saw what I saw," McGrady shot back. Then on a hunch he turned to Meredith. "Did anyone else call to report meteors falling into their fields?" "Why yes, I've got at least 3 other reports of it happening this week." "Surely. I'm going to need those addresses." "Sure thing, Sheriff, but it's only the one address. All of those other ones that were reported came down near the Jones Way Mill." "Where the Lincolns live?" Mike asked. "Sure is," Meredith told them. "Take care of Leroy, we need to go now," McGrady ordered, and with a sigh Mike trudged to his feet, somewhat ready to take on whatever was about to happen next. 9. 3 nights ago, Lincoln's Mill was a normal mill near the river, surrounded by corn farms that grew out in the middle of nowhere on the outskirts of Summerville. Until the meteors started falling. It was dinner time in the Lincoln house when suddenly the whole place was showered in bright green light, followed by an unearthly rumble, one that threatened to shatter the windows. All around them glasses, plates, and other stuff fell off of shelves and shattered onto the floor. The wall-mounted television almost followed suit. Before the family could even get up and discover the source of all the commotion, suddenly the front door was kicked in, and they were facing down creatures that looked more at home in a sci-fi flick at the drive-in than something that belonged in real life. Wide yellow eyes with narrow slits stared at them as creatures with large green scaly bodies made their way inside the house, the claws of their feet clacking off of the hardwood floor. Mr. Lincoln dropped a spoonful of mashed potatoes on the floor. His wife screamed, and then before their son could even stand, it was all over. After all, the lizard men of Clar were a force to be reckoned with. They were the scourge of the Andromeda Galaxy, and now they'd finally found their way to Earth. Once they put on their meat skins and dragged the corpses away, they knew it was time to carry out the mission. They must contact their command vessel and let them know that the landing area had been secured. They needed to know about this planet. This Earth, which was filled with valuable resources and was ripe to be conquered. The sounds coming from what looked like human throats was everything but a low, high-pitched hiss which would put most people's hair on end. Somewhere between a gator growl and a cobra's hiss, but it was the language of their home world. "Where is the 4th? The creature wearing Mrs. Lincoln's skin asked. Mr. Lincoln shrugged, adjusting his nose so it felt more natural. He'd hoped that he'd gotten the eye color close enough to avoid suspicion. Though based on these Earthlings' reaction, they needn't worry. If these humans, as they like to be called, were the dominant species here, then Earth was in a lot of trouble. 4th will continue the mission. We cannot waste time looking for him. No, we must send a message to our homeward. The warlords must be told of this place." "Of course," Mrs. Lincoln hissed, and the last of them, 3rd, slowly slid into the meat suit that had once been all 9 layers of Junior Lincoln's skin before they had shot him with one of their peelers. Now it was just a clever disguise they could morph their bodies around. Something they could use to infiltrate and move among the enemy before they attacked. A technique the Clar had been using to deadly precision for a very long time. Though for this world first suspected that they could come in hard and fast and there would be little that the Earthlings could do to stop them. He'd always preferred action to sneaking around anyway. 1. We have located a tower that we can use as a beacon. 2. Told him, leading him into the disgusting area of the humans' housing where they prepared animal filth and plant components for sustenance. In there, 3 was fiddling with a small square box powered by some sort of low-yield energy circuit. Listen. 3 told them, tuning one knob up. At first there was nothing but static, and then, howdy Summerites, citizens of Summerville, the weirdest place in the US. The kookiest and coolest small town we got. It's your host Z Dog, Lord of the Static Airways, and now some tunes. 3 turned the knob down before the music started to play. They call it radio, amplified. We should be able to get a message out, 3 told them. All we have to do is find the station. Well then, what are we waiting for? 1 commanded, his razor-sharp teeth, which no matter how hard he tried he couldn't seem to hide them behind the human's stolen lips. This was what he lived for. Now was the time for the hunt, and soon he would teach these earthlings to fear him. And once he did, then he would finally earn his true name. 10. This time the craters from the meteors were much closer to the house. 3 landing almost perfectly in a half-moon circle around what appeared to be an old mill on a small lake. The house itself was nice. It was a 2-story farmhouse with a scenic setting. But one look at it, and McGrady knew they weren't likely to find the Lincoln family still alive. The doors kicked in. Mike told him. As if McGrady couldn't see it for himself. Walking inside with his shotgun at the ready, McGrady swore. On the floor right in front of them there were several lifeless bodies. All of them had been skinned. Based on the pictures he saw on the walls, he didn't need his detective skills to figure out he was looking at the remains of the Lincoln family. All except the oldest daughter, who, based on a picture on the mantel, he deduced was away at college. Now he'd have to call her and let her know she was an orphan. To him that had always been one of the worst parts of detective work. Hey, come look at this. Mike called out from the kitchen. He began investigating once they'd determined that the house was empty. For now it appeared the intruders had left. Mike really hoped they didn't come back. Though based on the current amount of carnage being left around town, that wouldn't end well for them either. It would just mean more bodies on the way. In the kitchen, Mike stood beside a radio sitting on the counter. Everything else around it had been cleared and lay broken on the floor. McGrady understood the other man's train of thought immediately. Why wreck everything and then fiddle with a radio? We know they're after something. Mike offered. Why stick around town after falling out of the sky? Summerville isn't exactly the pinnacle of Western civilization. McGrady looked around. So what? They needed batteries, components. Why would the radio interest them? He speculated out loud, pulling at the ends of his mustache. Mike shrugged and turned it on. Classic rock started playing. Maybe they came here to jam out to Zeppelin? He joked. Haha. Is this a local station? McGrady asked. Yeah, why? Mike shot back, turning the radio off. It felt weird listening to music in a house where at least 3 dead people were in the other room, cooling under throw blankets. Because we've been thinking about this all wrong, McGrady told him, slamming his hand on a nearby table. They need a radio tower. That's why they're camouflaging themselves. They want to send a message to someone. Something tells me that under no circumstances does letting that happen play out in our favor, Mike said, picking his shotgun up and heading back to the car. Where are you going? McGrady asked him. To the radio station. It's right up the road, Mike answered, not slowing down. Shit. McGrady swore and followed him, running to the car. They'd barely sat down in the seats when he cranked the keys in the cruiser and revved the engine up the dirt driveway, leaving a thick cloud of dust behind him as they blew down the gravel road. He didn't even bother turning on the sirens. After all, it might be better if these creatures didn't know that they're coming. In his lap, Mike held a recent picture of the Lincoln family. That way they knew who they were looking for. McGrady had already told him they were officially now working under the shoot first question later mantra. What were they going to do? Arrest the skin-stealing invaders from another planet? Hell with that. For starters, McGrady wasn't even sure how to write something like that up. He suspected that even attempted to would be the end of his career if he was lucky. If not, it would be the end of his freedom too. People that went around talking about skin-stealing aliens usually would up with long stays in padded rooms against their will. That was all stuff to think about later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was stopping these things before they had the chance to hurt anyone else. Or worse, finish whatever diabolical mission they had planned. Up here on the left? Mike shouted, causing the sheriff to take a hard turn that threw them tight against the sides of the doors and made the tires squeal. The car went up on 2 tires for a minute before falling back down. Lights were still on in the building, which hopefully meant whoever was inside was still fine. He really hoped that was the case. Last thing he wanted was to find more skinless corpses. McGrady had never seen a radio station before, not one that he could remember anyway. But something told him they all didn't look like Summerville's own WS 92.9. In fact, he was willing to bet money on it. The radio station looked like a smaller version of the Alamo. Except instead of cannons and other things mounted to the sides of the wall, it had satellite dishes covering one wall and a radio tower jutting up from the middle. It even had its own junkyard and several small RVs on the lot, all of which had a for rent sign in front of them. McGrady raised an eyebrow at them as they climbed out of the cruiser. Mike shrugged. Z-Dog doesn't get government funding, and I guess some people like to vacation down here. Sure. McGrady said, looking around and mentally filing that away as a problem for another day. I guess it really does take all kinds. Mike raised his shotgun at the three people standing in front of the radio station, talking in a strange language that was all hisses and growls. That can't be good. Mike told him. Nope, definitely not. McGrady making sure his own safety was off as he walked forward. Let's go get us some answers. Easier said than done. Mike muttered as they stopped about 20 feet from the creatures wearing the Lincoln's family skin. They hadn't noticed them yet, too preoccupied with trying to get in the doors of the radio station, which were apparently locked and barred. In fact, all the windows were. Z-Dog's paranoid. Mike commented. Very paranoid. His daytime talk shows, for instance. Well, let's just say that the town might owe him an apology after all this. Does he have a real name? None that I know of. Mike answered, raising his gun. McGrady did the same. Hey, you skin-stealing sons of bitches, I'm the sheriff around here and you've got some goddamn answering to do. The three creatures turned around and looked at them quizzically. Yeah, and I'm Mike from Mike's Grocery and Mercantile Home to all of your home good needs, you sons of bitches. Mike yelled, this time causing even McGrady to look at him. Sorry, Mike muttered. Got caught in the moment and fell back on what I knew. Lay down or get shot. McGrady told them. The creature wearing Mrs. Lincoln's face walked towards them. Sheriff McGrady didn't hesitate before pulling the trigger. The shotgun bucked against his shoulder and the creature flew back as the buckshot tore through its flesh, borrowed or otherwise. When it made a move to get up, he fired again, causing its head to explode in a shower of dark green gore. Well, that ain't normal, Mike told him. The other creatures had apparently seen enough to know that they were dangerous. The one wearing Mr. Lincoln sprinted into the junkyard, the other climbed the wall of the radio station as in an attempt to make it up the tower. Shit, McGrady said. Please, Mike begged. Don't say it. Mike. No, anything but. We've got to split up, McGrady told him flatly. 11. Mike really didn't enjoy splitting up. In fact, it was his least favorite thing he'd done all day, which was really saying something. The next time the sheriff came into the grocery store, Mike wasn't going to leave and play deputy, that was for sure. Civic duty be damned. And on top of that, no more special discounts. If the sheriff wanted bologna and coffee, he was going to have to pay full price plus a hazard fee for almost getting Mike killed. He was a grocer, for God's sakes, not some type of science fiction adventure hero. These things fell from the sky and wear people's skin. How were they supposed to beat them? Sure, the sheriff had gotten one, but they'd been unaware then. Now that they knew what guns could do, they wouldn't make the same mistake again. Hadn't the man seen any movies? Splitting up was always what got someone killed, especially sidekicks like him. If this was a movie, Mike would be one of the first ones killed, or worse, used as some sort of bait. One that usually ended in some long, drawn-out death scene to establish the main character's emotional depth. For the first time in his entire life, Mike really wished he'd watched fewer movies. And why did the sheriff get to go inside while Mike, of all people, got to walk around in the junkyard in search of a murderous, skin-stealing alien from another world? Where had his life gone wrong? Spinning at the sound of banging metal, Mike looked around the slowly rusting cars. Nothing moved. And the sun was steadily going down. The only thing worse than hunting some sort of alien monster was having to do the same thing in the dark. Taking another step, Mike almost tripped as he heard something deeper in the piles of junk. Looked like the creature was done hiding. Mike gulped as he realized there was no way that was going to be a good thing. Hearing an odd pinging sound, he dove just in time as some sort of bright green ray went over the top of his head. It slammed into an old Buick and Mike watched, almost mesmerized, as the metal peeled off the frame on one side like a banana. Jesus Christ, he said, wondering what kind of weapon could do that. And what sort of civilization would be evil enough to devise it. Guns were one thing, but this was another level of cruelty. He popped up and fired in the blast direction. He heard a thunk as the shell slammed into another junk car, but moved around to a better position to fire from, hoping that he'd at least kept his enemy's head down. When he popped back up, he almost immediately wished that he hadn't. There, standing beside a battered Volvo, was the creature in all its horrible glory. It was tall. Taller than any man, making him realize it must have some sort of ability to compress its body into whatever skin it was wearing. At first he wanted to call it a lizard, but that wasn't right. Its skin wasn't scaly enough, it looked more like it glistened, and it seemed to be thick but also smooth. Like some sort of reptilian toad hybrid from hell. And on it was holding what looked like a bad prop from a 60s sci-fi film. Some sort of square pistol that seemed to fire around what looked like an egg beater on the end. It stopped being funny though as greenish-blue energy gathered around the end. The creature hissed something that Mike could only imagine probably meant die puny human. Or some variant of that. Mike dove as the creature fired. This time the blast was so big that it actually destroyed the car he'd been hiding behind, causing it to curl in on itself. One thing he'd learned though in all of this was that the creature had to charge his shots. Which meant to Mike's way of thinking he just might have a chance of surviving after all. Coming up on one knee, Mike fired his shotgun. His shot went a little wide, only managing to graze and somewhat piss off the creature. Greenish blood oozed out its side where pellets had hit it. The creature yelled and threw down its weapon. Roaring, it charged Mike with its claws at the ready and its mouth open to bite him. Mike screamed and fired again, only to hear a dull click as the gun jammed. Ah shit. Mike swore and flipped the gun over and swung it like a baseball bat, catching the creature square in the teeth. Please stay down, Mr. Alien. Mike pleaded. If the creature could understand him, it certainly didn't listen. The alien rose and spat a glob of goo on the ground filled with its own teeth. Mike gulped as the creature ran at him and grabbed him. Mike screamed again, this time as the creature picked him up and threw him. He slammed on the ground with such force that everything seemed to hurt all at once and the air was pushed from his lungs. Crap, crap, crap. He muttered as he rolled in the dust, trying to get back up on his feet. The creature made a strange croaking noise in the back of its throat. That son of a bitch was laughing at him, Mike realized as he stumbled around, still somewhat disoriented. His hand closing around something metal with a handle. At first he thought it was his shotgun, but then quickly realized his error. But it still would work fine for his purposes. He squeezed the trigger and held on to it. As the green crackling light gathered at the end, the alien wasn't laughing anymore as it charged him. Murder and malice in its reptilian yellow eyes. Mike prayed that he'd held the trigger long enough. He released the trigger just as the creature was almost on him. Both it and he screamed at the same time. The creature's skin ripped off of it, landing in a nice bundle behind it. The now dead skinless creature toppled on top of Mike. He gagged at the smell and feel of the cold, clammy flesh of the beast. Its insides now on its outside as he scrambled to get out from underneath it. Shaking, he pushed it off him and climbed to his feet. I'm throwing these clothes out. All of them. He decided, doubting that the smell would ever actually leave them. Just then gunfire echoed from inside the radio station. 12. But Grady had one enormous obstacle in his way. He was not in fact Spider-Man, nor was he whatever freakish thing these creatures were. So he couldn't simply climb the bare face of a building. Which meant he'd have to find a way inside the old-fashioned way. And with that in mind, he did the one thing that he knew the aliens couldn't or wouldn't have been able to when trying to gain access. He knocked on the door. Hello Z-Dog, this is Sheriff McGrady. I need you to open up. Nothing. McGrady licked his lips. On the one hand, he didn't want to just barge into a citizen's house and infringe on their liberties. On the other hand, there was a skin-stealing alien monster climbing on the man's roof. Please don't shoot me. He muttered, hoping Z-Dog wasn't the shoot first and ask later type, and he used his shotgun to blow the door off the hinges. It only took 2 shots. If anyone was alive in there, then he definitely had their attention. The door dropped forward and slammed into the dirt. Inside, classic rock blared throughout the building. A dreaded-up old hippie lay on a beanbag chair facing the door, a revolver in one hand and a joint in the other. You the new sheriff? Z-Dog asked, turning the music down a little. Yeah, do you have a roof access? McGrady asked. Z-Dog nodded. Of course, man. What's up? Skin-changing aliens up there and I need to stop it. Z-Dog raised his eyebrows. I knew this day was coming. He said, standing up. Follow me. McGrady shrugged and walked around Z-Dog's house and Summerville's only radio station. It was filled with every relic and strange souvenir from the 60s and 70s that he could imagine. Right down to the shag carpet. To make things worse, everything smelled like a strange mixture of patchouli, marijuana, and stale food. McGrady was happy to think that Z-Dog was only keeping the legal limit of pot. He was also willing to pretend that all the plants he was walking by were tomato plants. Some things just weren't worth the paperwork, and right now they definitely had bigger issues to worry about. This alien come in a saucer? Z-Dog asked, looking back as they climbed the stairs. No meteors. Probably just scouts then, still not good. Z-Dog. Anytime an alien tries to hide what they're doing, it usually means they trying to invade, or something else just as nefarious. That's not good. McGrady commented, wondering secretly if Z-Dog was the local nutcase or the only person he'd met so far that actually knew what was going on. These days it was hard to tell. You know a lot about aliens? Z-Dog grunted. I pay attention. That doesn't mean I know all there is. I've noticed this town is a little odd. McGrady commented. That's one word for it. Z-Dog replied, opening the door to the room. McGrady realized that now he'd have to come back and talk to Z-Dog. Maybe he'd know more about what happened to the last sheriff, or maybe he'd know something that would keep him alive in this place long enough to find out. He didn't have time to ask any more questions as he followed Z-Dog up the stairs to the roof. For an older man, he sure could move. McGrady was huffing and puffing by the time they made it to the roof, but it didn't even look like he was breaking a sweat. The alien was across the way. He was pulling wires from a box at the base of the tower. It worked quickly as it tried to re-tie several wires together. Z-Dog didn't hesitate, firing several rounds at the creature that was still wearing the skin of the youngest member of the Lincoln family. It stood as the shots went wide and it walked towards them, looking at them curiously. Before it reached up and grabbing its nose, it pulled its borrowed face clean off, revealing the bulbous greenish amphibian-like head underneath. Its eyes narrowed down to angry slits. Then the creature hissed at them and charged. McGrady took careful aim and waited for the creature to get closer. When it was close enough, he squeezed the trigger and the blast of a shotgun cut through the afternoon. Three's head exploded and showered them in gore. Z-Dog spit some of the green gore out of his mouth and wiped it from his eyes. "That's just gross." "You got that right," McGrady told him. "Sheriff?" They heard Mike called from down below. "Is that Mike the grocer?" Z-Dog asked quizzically. McGrady shrugged. "Needed a deputy. Not much to choose from." Z-Dog nodded and laughed. "Makes sense." Downstairs they met up with Mike, who looked a little bedraggled. He had his shotgun in one hand and some futuristic-looking pistol in the other. "Did you all get the ones on the roof?" "Just the one," Z-Dog said, sitting back down and lighting up another doobie. "Only one up there." "What about the one in the scrapyard?" McGrady asked him. "Dad saw what those things look like too. Some kind of frog lizard thing." "We saw," Z-Dog told them, inhaling deeply and then coughed a bit. "We still need to get the last one," McGrady said, wishing he had a beer and something to eat. He was tired of this hunting these creatures but wanted to settle the score with the last one. "Wouldn't it come here to finish the mission that these started?" Mike offered. McGrady looked over at Z-Dog. "What?" Z-Dog asked. "Are there any other radio towers in the county?" Z-Dog shrugged. "Well, there's this one and then there is the old one over at K-Boogie. The old honky-tonk station. I wouldn't go there though. That place gives me the heebie-jeebies." "Why's that?" Mike asked, looking concerned. Z-Dog looked at them seriously. "That place ain't right. That whole radio staff disappeared one day. The place has been empty ever since." "How close is it to here?" McGrady asked. "It's out by the old granary on Route 13. Z-Dog told them. Mike nodded. "I know where that is." "Good, then let's go finish this," McGrady said, reloading his shotgun. 13. The old radio station was right where Z-Dog had said it was. The large grain silo stood out, making it easy to spot. Behind it, the sun was quickly setting. Soon it would be completely dark and they'd have to find this thing in the dark. But either way, McGrady was ready to finish this. The thought of going back to the station without killing this last creature would drive him crazy, not to mention he'd never be able to live with himself if something he did led to others being hurt. And stopping a possible alien invasion was pretty high on that list. One look at the station and he understood why Z-Dog didn't want to come there. Unlike his place, this radio station was smaller, but the building itself was longer, like whoever built it opted for a one long hallway instead of a second floor. Luckily for both of them, the actual radio tower was out front, so they didn't have to go inside. The only problem was the creature was nowhere in sight. They pulled the cruiser to a stop and got out. McGrady sighed, wishing that this could have just been cut and dry. The door to the station was wide open. Clearly kicked in by a large clawed foot, they were going to have to go inside. It now looked like they were going to have to go inside, whether they wanted to or not. "The guns have a flashlight down near the muzzle," McGrady said tiredly, showing Mike how to switch it on. "Just be sure not to blind me or yourself." "There's a cord running inside from the tower," Mike told him, flashing his light down at the ground. If they had something better to use, they could cut it, but it was thick. McGrady didn't want to take the chances that they might just end up electrocuting themselves. McGrady walked up and posted on the door, hoping they wouldn't have to go too far inside. Something about this place made him feel like he was being watched. Quickly entering the doorway, which opened up into a wide open space. The entire building seemed like one big hallway with doorways off to the sides. In the third one down, they could clearly see a strange blue light and hear what sounded like one of those creatures, and it was definitely talking to someone. Mike looked over at the sheriff and nodded. Together they walked down the hallway. McGrady stood just outside the doorway before popping in. He took a quick look inside and at first he saw nothing. Nodding to Mike, he popped inside and raised his gun. Before he knew what happened, a large clawed hand grabbed the barrel and threw him backwards into the wall. The sound of his shotgun clattering uselessly on the ground echoed in his ears. Mike swore and raised his own gun and fired. The creature was too fast and jumped out of the way. The alien dived on top of Mike and raised its claws, about to tear into the immobile grocer with everything it had. McGrady lay stunned against the wall. Taking a deep breath, he rose to his feet and grabbed the alien's arm, trying to do everything in his power to stop it from killing Mike. The creature was stronger than any of them could imagine. McGrady didn't know how long he could hold on. Suddenly Mike roared up and plunged his thumb straight into the creature's eyes while it was still trying to fight off the sheriff who was holding on for dear life. It roared and stumbled back, flopping against the wires and tripping backwards into the room. McGrady didn't hesitate in scooping up Mike's shotgun. He quickly brought it to his shoulder and blew the creature's head off. The loud blast had both of their ears ringing as they moved deeper into the room. There on the floor was what seemed to be a salvaged laptop plugged into some sort of salvaged radio transmitter. McGrady wasn't sure how it worked or how to stop it. Before he could voice his concerns, Mike solved the problem for both of them by stomping the laptop. The screen broke and went blue. Sparks fizzled and popped on the transmitter box. They heard a small mechanical whirl, and then the lights from the electronics fizzled out completely and left them in the dark. That's one way to handle it, McGrady mused. Think that's the end of it? Mike asked him. I hope so, McGrady said, clapping him on the back. Now let's get the hell out of here and get something to eat. I'm starving. Epilogue. McGrady sat in silence while looking over the reports leading up to the last sheriff's disappearance. Nothing about them made any sense whatsoever. A couple domestic disturbance calls and one abandoned vehicle. But that was it. Nothing out of the ordinary that would make McGrady think that anything out of the ordinary was going on. But there were still so many unanswered questions. Like, for instance, who had cleaned out the house before he got here? Surely the last sheriff had kept case files at home. Or mementos for that matter. The whole place had been completely sanitized, as though whoever had done it was a professional. Of course he'd asked Meredith about it, but she hadn't known anything. At least that's what she said, though McGrady doubted that there wasn't much that happened in this town that Meredith didn't know something about. Getting her to tell him was the issue. Like the rest of the town, she didn't seem to want to open up to him about the weirdness that seemed to permeate everything in Summerville. His first act as sheriff, he'd stopped an alien invasion, and it didn't even make the news. It was like the whole town had gone back to normal overnight. There was a knock on the front door of his house. Sheriff McGrady cocked back the hammer on his revolver. After the events of last night, he wasn't willing to take chances. Who is it? He asked as he walked over to the door, peeping out of the small glass hole at the top of the door. It's Mike. Sure enough, that's who it was. Mike was standing there in gym pants and a t-shirt holding a six-pack. You going to let me in? Mike asked again. McGrady sighed and put the hammer back down on the gun. Putting it down on the counter, he slid back the deadbolt and undid the chain on the door. Hold on, he told him as he pulled open the door. Mike said, listening to the way the door scraped across the floor. When did you replace the door? What? McGrady asked. I haven't lived here long enough to have the door replaced. What are you talking about? Must have been the old sheriff, then the door isn't the right size for the frame. However, try to get their money back because whoever did this, they definitely didn't sand the bottom down like they're supposed to. I'll take it into consideration if I can find out who did, McGrady replied, shutting the door and walking over to the living room, wondering if the old sheriff had done it himself or if it was because the door had to be fixed quickly before the new tenant moved in. Either way, it raised a whole other set of questions that would keep him up at night. The only thing that McGrady liked about mysteries, and he meant really liked about them, was solving them. An unsolved mystery to him was like a song he couldn't get out of his head until he remembered all the words. Mike sat on the couch and handed him a beer. McGrady wasn't a big beer guy, but he took it anyway. I just wanted to thank you for saving my life the other night, Mike told him, sipping his beer. You don't have to, I'm sure you would have done the same for me, McGrady told him. Mike shrugged. I'm not a big tough guy, so don't rely on that. I'm just a grocery store owner, you know. McGrady laughed. I'm serious. What happened to those bodies anyway? Mike asked him. McGrady shrugged. The coroner came and got all of them. Don't know what he did to them, but he acted like he'd dealt it before. Really? Mike asked, leaning forward. McGrady took a deep gulp of his beer. I don't know, but he didn't seem surprised to see them, that's for sure. All I know is that the guy creeps me out. Well, his name is Warren Creepsley, Mike told him. What's with the old-style suits he wears? McGrady asked him. Who knows, a lot of people swear he sells the bodies to that biolab on the outskirts of town. Mike told him, trying to get comfortable. What the hell am I sitting on? He asked, reaching down in between the cushions. He came out with a manila mailing folder with a lump right in the middle. What the hell is that? McGrady asked him, shocked. Hell if I know, it's your house, Mike told him, putting it on the coffee table. McGrady reached out and dumped the contents out on the coffee table. Inside of it was a manila envelope which looked like a case file. A personal recorder and a key fob depicting a winking alligator with one key on it. "You got any place to be?" McGrady asked him. Mike shook his head. "Nope, looks like we got another mystery."